Before I begin, one important note. In the public spoiler coverage I could verify, Daphne and Carter were dealing with a pregnancy scare, and at least one recent spoiler discussion framed fan concern around Daphne feeling unwell. But I did not find a reliable public source confirming the exact diagnosis you mentioned, namely cervical cancer with a forced choice between terminating the pregnancy or dying. So I'm treating that diagnosis as a dramatic expansion based on your premise, while keeping it emotionally grounded in the current Daphne pregnancy/health setup. In the bold and the beautiful, the cruelest tragedies rarely begin with a scream. They begin with hope. They begin with a woman touching her own stomach in private, half afraid to believe what her body seems to be telling her, half desperate to believe that life has finally decided to be gentle for once. They begin with plans made too early, with soft smiles exchanged over breakfast, with a future that suddenly looks close enough to touch. That is why this storyline has the power to become one of the most emotionally devastating arcs the show could tell, because it does not start from darkness. It starts from possibility. Daphne is not standing in a battlefield when this pain finds her. She is standing at the doorway of a life she thought she might finally be allowed to keep. She has love within reach, a child perhaps beginning to exist inside her, and the fragile fantasy that after all the manipulations, rivalries, wounds, and restless compromises that define this world, maybe she and Carter are at last approaching something whole. That is precisely what makes the diagnosis so merciless. Illness in soap opera storytelling becomes most unbearable when it does not merely threaten life, but threatens meaning. And here, the diagnosis would not simply tell Daphne that she is sick. It would tell her that the very thing that awakened her hope may now become the reason she dies unless she gives it up. That is not just medical devastation. It is spiritual violence. It is a woman being forced to choose which version of loss she can survive. Daphne, in a story like this, cannot be written as merely frightened. Fear would be too small a word for what such news would do to her. A diagnosis of cervical cancer during pregnancy, especially if the doctors presented in brutal terms, would tear apart the logic by which she has understood her future. One moment she is imagining nursery colors, hidden smiles, and the cautious way Carter might begin to dream aloud about fatherhood. The next, she is sitting in a sterile room with a specialist whose voice is measured because professionals learn to deliver catastrophe as if calmness can soften the blade. She hears percentages, treatment windows, risks, progression, urgency. She hears words like invasive, advanced, immediate intervention. She hears that waiting could cost her everything. She hears that protecting the pregnancy may mean sacrificing her own survival. She hears that if she delays treatment, the disease may move faster than love, faster than hope, faster than prayer, faster than any promise Carter could make. And because she is Daphne, because she is not the kind of woman who collapses neatly into helplessness, her first instinct may not be tears at all. It may be denial wrapped in composure. It may be the desperate intelligence of someone trying to outthink pain before pain can settle inside her. That reaction would be deeply human. When a woman is handed a diagnosis that reorganizes her entire life in a single afternoon, she does not always break down immediately. Sometimes she becomes sharper, colder, more focused. She starts asking technical questions because numbers feel easier than grief. She asks whether there is another doctor, another hospital, another procedure, another country, another specialist, another miracle hidden in some corner of medical possibility. She asks because the alternative is to sit still and feel the truth. Daphne, especially, would likely cling to action at first because action creates the illusion of control. It allows her to behave as though this is still a problem that can be solved rather than a wound that must be endured. But beneath that sharpness, everything inside her would already be splitting apart. Because the central horror, here, is not simply illness. It is motherhood turned into a countdown. It is the unbearable knowledge that whatever she chooses, the choice itself will haunt her. Carter's role in such a storyline could become one of the most painful and complex emotional journeys the show has given him in years. Carter is often written as a man who carries deep feeling beneath restraint, a man who wants sincerity even in a world that rewards performance, a man whose greatest weakness is that he still believes love can be honorable if he simply gives enough of himself to it. That is exactly why this kind of crisis would destroy him so completely. If Daphne tells him the truth, if she sits across from him and tries to say the words without collapsing, Carter would immediately understand that there is no safe response. No matter what he says, he risks becoming the man who seems to choose either the woman or the baby. If he tells her to end the pregnancy and save herself, he may fear that she will hear cowardice, betrayal, or a lack of love for their child. If he tells her to fight for the baby no matter the cost, he becomes monstrous even in his own eyes, a man willing to bury the woman he loves beneath the altar of fatherhood. And if he says he supports whatever she decides, that too may sound hollow, because what Daphne is facing is too brutal to be softened by declarations of support. Carter would not merely be heartbroken. He would be trapped inside an impossible moral landscape where every expression of love feels contaminated by loss. That is what gives this storyline such weight. It is not about a right answer. It is about the collapse of the fantasy that love can protect people from certain choices. Carter may desperately want to be strong for Daphne, but real strength in a story like this is ugly. It is sleepless nights. It is breaking down in hallways where no one can see him. It is learning that devotion does not always look noble. Sometimes devotion means sitting beside the woman you love while she mourns a child who is not yet gone but may have to be given up. Sometimes devotion means watching her rage at you for asking her to live. Sometimes devotion means telling her you cannot lose her and then hating yourself because part of you knows that statement places your own fear on top of her suffering. Carter would not be a clean hero here. He would be a grieving man trying not to become another burden to the person carrying the greatest pain. And Daphne's pain would not come in a single form. That is what must be understood if this story is to feel emotionally true. There would be fear of dying, yes, but also shame for even thinking first about survival when a life may be growing inside her. There would be maternal attachment, perhaps sudden and overwhelming, even if the pregnancy is early enough that logic says not to become attached yet. The body does not obey logic. The heart does not wait for certainty. The moment a woman believes a child may be there, she begins in some deep and private way to rearrange herself around that possibility. So if doctors tell Daphne that ending the pregnancy may be the only path to treatment, they are not merely asking her to undergo a medical procedure. They are asking her to grieve a future while still alive inside it. They are asking her to become the one who consents to the ending. That detail matters because many women can endure tragedy more easily than they can endure the feeling of having signed their name beneath it. Even when the choice is made under medical duress, even when survival is on the line, guilt often enters anyway. It whispers that perhaps she should have waited one more week, searched one more doctor, prayed one more prayer, suffered one more risk. Guilt thrives wherever certainty is impossible. This is where Daphne's internal conflict could become almost unbearable to watch, because she would not only be choosing between life and pregnancy. She would be choosing between two versions of herself. In one version, she is the woman who sacrifices the child to survive, and she must then live with every memory, every date, every empty room, every glance from Carter, every silence in her own body after the procedure. In the other version, she is the woman who risks death to carry the child, and she must then look into Carter's face and quietly decide that her love for the baby outweighs her responsibility to remain alive with him. Both versions destroy something sacred. That is why she may resist the decision with all the force she has. Not because she is irrational, but because to choose quickly would feel like a betrayal of both selves at once. She would likely search for a third path obsessively, because third paths are what people invent when reality becomes too cruel to accept. She would ask if treatment can wait. She would ask if the pregnancy can be managed longer. She would ask if surgery can be delayed. She would ask if other women have survived doing both. She would become the sort of person who memorizes medical terms overnight because language becomes the only weapon left against helplessness. If written well, this story could also expose the emotional politics of everyone around Daphne, because a crisis like this never stays contained between two people. Families rush in, and with them come old wounds, private agendas, moral beliefs, projections, and fear disguised as advice. In a show like this, no illness remains purely medical. It becomes social. It becomes symbolic. It reveals who people really are when there is no easy way to appear noble. Some characters would insist that Daphne must save herself, speaking with urgency that sounds compassionate but may also carry a terror of death they cannot bear to name. Others might romanticize sacrifice, treating the unborn child as destiny and subtly pressuring Daphne to become a martyr, while they themselves pay none of the physical cost. Someone would likely say that miracles happen, as though hope itself can replace treatment. Someone else would speak too bluntly, too clinically, reducing her agony to a practical calculation and leaving her feeling even more alone. And through all of it, Daphne would discover a brutal truth known to many women in crisis, that the moment her body becomes the site of a moral battle, people start speaking about her as though she is both central and somehow secondary, both the patient and the vessel, both the person suffering and the space in which everyone else stages their beliefs. That is why Daphne's voice has to remain the emotional center of the story. Not because she will always know what she wants, but because uncertainty itself must belong to her. If she immediately agrees to end the pregnancy, the story becomes too simple, too practical, and loses the sacred emotional contradiction that gives it power. If she immediately decides to keep the baby no matter what, the story risks flattening her into an ideal of sacrifice rather than a real woman confronting terror. The most moving and truthful path is that Daphne does not know at first, and her not knowing becomes its own torment. She may wake up one morning determined to save herself, feeling a hard and trembling clarity that Carter needs her alive and that survival is not selfish. Then, a few hours later, she may place a hand over her stomach and break down because the thought of ending the pregnancy feels like participating in an execution she cannot emotionally survive. She may say one thing to Carter and another to herself. She may agree to treatment on paper and then freeze at the hospital doors. She may begin to resent everyone for needing her to decide when every option feels like violence. Carter, meanwhile, would likely begin to fracture in private. He may try to become practical because he believes practicality is kindness, but Carter is too emotionally open a man to live long inside that mask. He would start imagining life without Daphne and find that thought unendurable. He would imagine telling their child one day that Daphne died because she would not let go, and that image might break him. Then, just as powerfully, he would imagine going home with Daphne after the pregnancy is ended, trying to rebuild a life in the shadow of the child they lost, and that image might haunt him differently. Every future becomes grief-shaped. That is the true cruelty here, not simply that one of them may die, but that even the version in which both survive emotionally intact may not exist. Carter might even begin blaming himself for the timing of their happiness, for the pregnancy itself, for not noticing symptoms sooner, for believing life was finally opening instead of preparing to collapse. Love often becomes irrational in the presence of possible death. People search for causes inside themselves because self-blame can feel easier than accepting randomness. And then there is the question at the center of your prompt. Would Daphne accept ending the pregnancy, or would she fight to keep the baby? The emotionally richest answer is that she would not accept it easily, and for a significant stretch of the storyline she would refuse in her heart even if her mind begins to understand the necessity. Daphne may initially cling to the baby with almost fierce desperation, not because she is careless about her own life, but because pregnancy in this context would symbolize more than motherhood. It would symbolize renewal, innocence, a future not built on manipulation or compromise. After everything she may have endured emotionally, this child would feel like proof that her life still contains blessing, that tenderness has not abandoned her, that she and Carter are capable of creating something untouched by the ugliness around them. To be told to give that up would feel less like medical advice and more like cosmic cruelty, as if the universe waited until she finally opened her heart before demanding payment. So yes, she would likely fight. She would look for ways around the diagnosis. She would hold on longer than the doctors think is wise. She would insist on more tests, more scans, more expert opinions. She would probably tell herself that women survive worse, that this baby came for a reason, that she cannot be asked to choose death for the child while choosing life for herself. But if the story wants to honor emotional truth rather than melodramatic fantasy, it must allow reality to press harder over time. The illness would need to become unmistakably urgent. Her symptoms would worsen. Pain, bleeding, weakness, or a fresh scan might make clear that delay is no longer courageous, it is fatal. And that shift matters. Because Daphne's ultimate decision, if she chooses to end the pregnancy, should not come from sudden obedience or from someone else convincing her that the child matters less. It should come from a devastating redefinition of motherhood itself. She would have to reach the point where living does not feel like abandoning the baby, but carrying the memory forward. She would have to believe, however painfully, that choosing treatment is not choosing herself instead of the child, but refusing to let death take both. That is an excruciating psychological journey. Women facing this kind of choice often need a narrative that allows survival to coexist with love. Without that, treatment can feel like betrayal forever. One of the most powerful scenes such a storyline could give Daphne is a private one in which she speaks not to Carter, not to doctors, not to family, but to the child she may not be able to keep. Not dialogue in the conventional sense of soap confrontation, but a quiet emotional surrender in which she admits that she wanted this baby, that she loved this possibility before it even fully took shape, that she hates the world for forcing such a decision. That she does not know whether what she is about to do makes her weak or brave, only that she cannot let this disease erase every piece of her. A scene like that would transform the medical choice into something spiritually intimate. It would honor the fact that loss before birth is still loss, still attachment, still motherhood in a form many people around the grieving woman fail to understand. At the same time, there is also a dramatically compelling alternate route in which Daphne refuses termination and tries to carry the child anyway, at least for a while. That version of the story would not necessarily end with her death, but it would create a long corridor of dread through which every episode would move. Carter would become increasingly frantic. Doctors would grow more urgent. Other characters would divide into camps. Daphne would begin to deteriorate physically, and the audience would be forced to watch her conviction become both inspiring and horrifying. This path could be compelling because it reveals just how strongly she identifies the baby with hope. But it is also the darker route, the one that risks turning her into a martyr figure if not handled carefully. To avoid that trap, the writing would have to emphasize that Daphne is not choosing heroism. She is choosing against erasure. She is trying to hold on to the first future that has felt fully hers in a long time. She is not driven by purity, but by terror of emptiness. That makes her human. Still, if I had to judge the most emotionally coherent direction for the story, I would say Daphne ultimately chooses treatment and agrees to end the pregnancy, but only after resisting with everything in her. That path gives the storyline its deepest ache because it does not let anyone off easily. Daphne lives, but she does not emerge unscarred. Carter keeps her, but not without learning that survival can come carrying grief heavy enough to reshape a marriage. The show gains a long emotional aftermath rather than a single tragic climax. Daphne would have to live inside anniversaries, phantom hopes, and perhaps the unbearable experience of hearing others say she did the right thing, when right does not feel like the word for anything that happened. Carter would have to learn how to love her through grief he cannot fix. Their future family plans would no longer feel innocent. Every later conversation about trying again would carry fear. Every doctor's visit would echo. Every moment of happiness would contain the memory of the child who did not stay. That is a richer story than simple death, because it understands that surviving catastrophe is not the opposite of tragedy. Sometimes it is tragedy's longest form. Such a story could also deepen Daphne in a way few romantic plots can. Too often, women in these worlds are defined by who wants them, who betrays them, or which family conflict pulls them into orbit. But illness stories, when handled with emotional intelligence, reveal the private architecture of a character's soul. We would see whether Daphne is someone who closes up or reaches out, whether she turns fierce or fragile, whether she needs control or surrender, whether faith comforts her or enrages her. We would see how she behaves when beauty, charm, strategy, and emotional persuasion become useless. Because Cancer does not negotiate with glamour. It strips life down to frightening essentials. And in that stripping away, Daphne could become more layered, more raw, more unforgettable than she has ever been before. The supporting characters would matter tremendously in shaping that aftermath. Carter cannot be the only witness. Someone older, perhaps someone who has already lived through bodily loss, could offer Daphne the rare gift of not trying to solve her. Someone else might fail her by speaking carelessly, reminding the audience how isolated women in medical crisis often feel even inside families. Another character might become unexpectedly tender, revealing compassion where none was expected. These responses matter because grief is never experienced in a vacuum. It is altered by the quality of witness around it. A woman can survive the surgery and still be spiritually shattered if the people around her rush her recovery, avoid the subject, or treat the pregnancy as something she should not mention because at least she lived. That phrase, at least, can become its own cruelty. At least you survived. At least it was early. At least there will be other chances. At least, at least, at least. None of those phrases reaches the wound. They merely circle it. If the show truly wanted to make this storyline unforgettable, it would let Daphne remain changed. Not permanently broken, but permanently altered. She would return to work or to ordinary life with a quieter gaze, with moments where noise becomes intolerable, with flashes of anger at other people's easy assumptions. She might become protective in strange ways, sensitive to pregnancy news, suspicious of optimism, newly impatient with petty schemes. She might love Carter more fiercely and yet pull away from him at the same time because he represents both the life she kept and the life they lost. That contradiction would be fascinating. Grief after medically necessary termination can create distance even where love remains powerful because the couple does not always grieve in the same language. Carter might want to remember openly. Daphne might want silence. Or the opposite. One of them might cling harder. The other might need air. Their relationship would not be destroyed by lack of love, but challenged by the fact that love alone cannot organize grief into neat stages. And that is perhaps the most emotionally honest answer to your question. Would Daphne accept losing the baby, or would she fight to keep it? She would do both. She would fight first, because the baby represents hope, identity, tenderness, and a future. She is not ready to surrender. Then, if the medical reality becomes undeniable, she would accept treatment not with peace, not with relief, but with a shattered kind of courage. The acceptance would not erase the fight. The fight would become part of the grief. She would forever remember that there was a period when she still believed she could keep both life and child, and letting go of that belief would be one of the hardest things she has ever done. That is why the story works best not as a simple moral question, but as a portrait of how women survive impossible choices without ever truly escaping them. In the end, the power of this storyline lies in its softness as much as its pain. It is not a spectacular tragedy full of villains and explosions. It is a quiet catastrophe, a diagnosis in a room too bright to feel humane, a hand over stomach. A man trying not to cry because he thinks if he cries first she will have to comfort him. A woman staring at paperwork that reduces the most sacred and devastating choice of her life to signatures and dates. A couple sitting in the same house after the world has changed, speaking gently because loudness would make it too real. This kind of story stays with an audience because it touches the deepest fear beneath so many dreams, that happiness can arrive and be taken away in the same breath. So no, I do not believe Daphne would simply accept giving up the baby the moment doctors tell her she must. A character with emotional depth and a storyline with real dramatic power would never move that quickly. She would resist. She would bargain. She would hope against reason. She would search for loopholes in medicine and in fate itself. But if the writing remains grounded and heartbreakingly human, she would eventually choose to live. Not because the child meant less. Not because survival is easier. Not because the grief can be tidied into wisdom. She would choose to live because death would take everything, while life, however wounded, leaves open the possibility that love can still be carried forward. And that is the kind of choice soap opera does best when it is brave enough to slow down and let pain breathe, a choice that saves the body, breaks the heart.